My wife raised her glass and said loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear, "This is my lazy fat husband." Laughter burst out like someone struck a match in dry hay until the CEO cleared his throat and said, "Sarah, he's the boards man." For a second, nobody moved. The laughter didn't fade so much as it stopped like a radio that got switched off mid-song. I heard a fork scrape a plate. I heard ice settle in a glass. I even heard the faint buzz of the overhead lights, and I realized how quiet a room full of people can become when they suddenly remember they have mortgages. Sarah spat out her wine. It wasn't a delicate little cough either. It was a full shock spray that caught the light like a crimson mist. A couple of women near us gasped and stepped back. Someone patted the front of Sarah's satin blouse with a napkin, like they could erase what just happened. Sarah's cheeks went from rosy to chalky in a breath. Her eyes snapped to mine wide and furious, like I'd planned it all, like I'd hidden a landmine under her high heels. I didn't move. I stood there with a paper cup of hotel coffee in my hand, weak, bitter, and lukewarm, because I'd gotten it from the refreshment station on my way over. And that's the kind of detail that sticks with you in a moment like this. Not the music, not the glittering Christmas lights draped over the stage, not the giant Happy Holidays banner hung crooked above the dance floor. No, it's the coffee, it's the napkin, it's the way your wedding ring feels suddenly too tight on your finger. Greg Hollis, our CEO, looked over the rim of his glasses, expression calm as a Sunday sermon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He simply let the words land. "He's the boards man." The boards man. It sounded like something out of an old Western my father used to watch, some quiet fellow who rode into town without a gun showing, and everybody with dirty hands started sweating. Sarah's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Greg," she said, voice pitched too bright, too quick. What is this?" Greg's gaze didn't leave her face. "It's not this, Sarah. It's reality." A few people chuckled nervously, then stopped when no one else joined in. The room shifted the way a crowd shifts when they smell smoke, but don't see flames yet. Men in sport coats looked down at their shoes. Women in sequined dresses suddenly found their bracelets fascinating. Somebody's phone screen lit up, then went dark fast like they'd been caught. Sarah turned toward me so sharply her earrings swung. "Ray," she hissed through a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "What did you do?" I could have said a dozen things. I could have snapped back. I could have enjoyed the moment. But that wasn't me. I set my coffee cup down on the edge of the round table beside us. I smoothed my hand over my shirt front like I was brushing off dust. My heart was beating steady, but deep down under the calm, something old and heavy had started to shift. Something that had been stuck in place for years. "I didn't do anything tonight," I said quietly. "You did." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me." Greg cleared his throat again, a gentle sound that somehow carried through the entire ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "if you'll excuse us for a moment." He nodded toward a side door near the stage. Two men I didn't recognize, older, dressed plain, but expensive, no company logos, were standing there like they'd been waiting. One had silver hair and a face like carved wood. The other carried a thin leather folder under his arm. Boardmen, if I had to guess. Sarah followed Greg's glance and went still. Her lips pressed together so hard they turned pale. She knew those faces, or she knew what they meant. "Greg," she whispered, but now the edge in her voice was gone. Now it was something else. Fear. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah looked at me like she didn't know me. That was the hook right there in that silence. That was the moment the weight of 30 years shifted like an old house settling on a new foundation. But if you want to understand how we got there, how I, Ray Carter, age 55, born and raised outside Ottumwa, Iowa, ended up being called lazy by my own wife in front of a room full of her coworkers, you've got to go back a ways. Not to the beginning of our marriage, not even to the day she first started looking through me instead of at me. You've got to go back to the day I stopped being useful in the way she wanted. Because that's what it really was with Sarah, usefulness. I used to be useful. I used to walk into a room and people would stand up straighter. Not because I had money or power. Lord knows I didn't come from money, but because I had a reputation. I was the guy who knew the rules, and more importantly, I knew why they existed. I spent most of my working life in risk and compliance for Midwestern manufacturing outfits, paper mills, plastics, distribution warehouses. places where honest folks clocked in at 6 a.m. and expected their paychecks to clear and their pensions to still be there when their knees gave out. My last full-time job before everything changed was with Hawthorne Logistics, headquartered in Des Moines. Nothing fancy. Brown brick building parking lot full of pickup trucks and Camrys a flag out front that snapped in the winter wind. I wasn't a vice president. I wasn't anybody you'd see in a magazine. I was the man who got called when something smelled off. A vendor contract that didn't add up. A manager trying to bury an incident report. An expense account that suddenly ballooned like a tick on a hound dog. I didn't yell. I didn't make speeches. I just asked questions until the truth came out, and I wrote everything down. Old habit. My dad worked the line at John Deere. He used to say, "Boy, if it ain't written down, it didn't happen." He'd tap his temple like that was where you stored the real stuff, but he always kept a notebook in his shirt pocket anyway. Sarah loved that about me in the early years. She'd brag to her friends back when her friends were still people from town and not just sleek co-workers with perfect hair about how dependable I was, about how I handled things, about how nothing rattled me. "You want to know what's sexy," she told her sister once, half laughing in our kitchen while I carved a roast. "A man who knows what he's doing." She said it like she was proud. We lived in a modest ranch house, then on the south side of Des Moines, not far from a Casey's gas station, where the coffee was always too hot, and the breakfast pizza smelled like salvation at 5 in the morning. We weren't rich, but we weren't hurting. We did Friday fish fries at the VFW Post off Army Post Road. We saved. We paid our bills. We took one good vacation a year, nothing fancy, usually Branson or Wisconsin Dells. Sarah worked her way up, though. She had drive like I'd never seen. Started in accounts payable, then moved into operations support, then got a role in vendor relations. She learned the corporate language synergy deliverables optics. She stopped saying folks and started saying stakeholders. And I cheered her on. I meant it. I liked seeing her succeed. But somewhere along the line, her success became the only thing that mattered. Then my body failed me. It wasn't dramatic. No car crash. No heart attack in the driveway. Just the slow grind of years catching up. A back injury from lifting boxes in an audit room one winter when we were short-staffed. A knee that started swelling like it had a mind of its own. A doctor who looked at my chart and told me plain as day, "Ray, you keep doing 12-hour days and hauling files like you're 25, you're going to end up not doing anything at all." That was the first crack. The second crack came when my mother started slipping. Mom had always been sharp. She could balance a checkbook faster than any banker. She could remember everybody's birthday. Then she forgot the oven on. Then she forgot my name for a second, then laughed it off like it was nothing. By the time the diagnosis came early, Alzheimer's, Sarah's career was accelerating like a truck going downhill with bad brakes, and my life was slowing down like molasses in January. Someone had to take Mama to appointments. Someone had to make sure she ate. Someone had to sit with her when she got scared at night and thought she was back on the farm in 1962. That someone was me. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask for medals. I just did it. At first, Sarah acted supportive. She'd pat my shoulder and say, "You're such a good son." She'd post a picture of Mama holding our hand on Facebook with some soft caption about family. But then she started resenting it. Resenting the time. Resenting the way I wasn't moving anymore. Resenting the way my clothes weren't as crisp because I was too tired some nights to iron a shirt. Resenting the way my body changed. I put on weight, not because I was shoveling donuts into my face all day like Sarah liked to imply, but because stress does that to a man. Because sitting in waiting rooms and driving back roads to doctors' offices does that. Because when you're worn out, you eat what's easy, not what's ideal. And because I stopped caring about impressing people who didn't care about me, Sarah noticed every pound like it was a personal insult. She'd make little jokes at home. "Look at you," she'd say, tapping the arm of my recliner. "You in this chair, you're becoming one." I'd laugh weakly because what else do you do when your wife is testing how much pain you'll swallow? Then the jokes got sharper. The last time we went to a neighborhood cookout, she smiled at a couple of her newer co-workers, folks from Hawthorne who lived in our area, and said, "Ray's retired. He's basically a house cat now. Sleeps all day." I wasn't sleeping all day. I'd been up at dawn scraping ice off Mama's windshield and driving her to a neurologist in West Des Moines. But Sarah liked the picture she painted better than the truth. And the more she painted it, the more people believed it. That's the thing about stories. If you tell them loud enough, long enough, they become real to everyone listening, even when they're a lie. I started keeping quiet. Not because I was beaten, because I was watching. I'm not proud of everything I did after that. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was some saint who never wanted payback. I'm a man. I got hurt. I got humiliated. I wanted justice, and there were nights I wanted something meaner than justice. But I also had a line I wasn't willing to cross. That line would matter later. Back then, in the months leading up to the year-end party, our life had gotten thin, quiet in all the wrong ways. Sarah stayed late at work. When she came home, she talked in short bursts about issues and deliverables and people who can't get their act together. She treated our home like a hotel room she didn't want to be stuck in. I spent my days doing what I'd always done, just in a smaller world. I'd swing by Casey's for coffee and stand there for a minute, listening to the older guys talk about corn prices and grandkids and knee replacements. I'd stop at Veridian Credit Union to sign something for Mama's account and chat with the teller who always asked how she was doing. I'd go down to the basement and sort boxes, old tax papers, old notebooks, old files from my working days. Sarah called it hoarding. I called it being prepared. One afternoon, maybe 6 weeks before that party, I was down there with the furnace humming and the smell of dust in my nose, flipping through a battered folder labeled Hawthorne. Vendor policies. Sarah had tossed it years ago, or thought she had. I'd rescued it out of the trash without even thinking. Habit. I remember running my thumb along the pages, feeling the rough edge where someone had torn out a section and thinking, that's odd. Then I heard Sarah's heels overhead, tap, tap, moving across the kitchen floor. She was on the phone, voice sharp. I don't care how you do it, she snapped. Just make sure it doesn't come back to us. I froze, holding that folder like it weighed 50 pounds. And in that moment, down in the basement of my own home, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit for a long time. My wife wasn't just unkind. She was scared. And scared people do stupid, ugly things. That's when the board first reached out. Not with drama, not with mystery, with paperwork. And when you've lived long enough, you learn the real power in this world isn't in shouting. It's in paper. The word lazy stuck to me after that night, like burrs on denim. Sarah didn't apologize on the drive home. She didn't even yell. She drove with both hands tight on the wheel jaw, clenched radio off. The city lights slid past the windshield in long yellow streaks, and the heater rattled like it always did when the temperature dropped below freezing. When we pulled into the driveway, she said, "You embarrassed me." I almost laughed at that, almost. Instead, I said, "We'll talk later," because that's what men say when they know a conversation won't go anywhere good. She slept in the guest room that night. I lay awake in our bed listening to the old house creak as the temperature fell, thinking about how words can erase a man faster than time ever could. By morning, the story had already settled in her head. I was lazy, I was fat, I was deadweight. That was the version of me she'd been carrying around for years, polishing it up and trotting it out whenever she needed a laugh or a little boost in front of other people. The party hadn't created that picture. It had just put a spotlight on it. The truth was quieter. The truth was mornings that started before sunrise, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my back locked up if I stayed in bed too long. I'd swing my legs over the edge of the mattress and sit there for a minute, breathing through it, waiting for the stiffness to ease. The truth was standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee I shouldn't be drinking, because it upset my stomach watching the frost creep along the edges of the window. The truth was my mother's pill organizer laid out on the table like a little plastic calendar each day, a reminder that time doesn't ask permission. I didn't stop working because I wanted to. I stopped because life narrowed. When Mama's diagnosis came, Sarah was already on her second promotion. Her schedule filled with meetings that had titles instead of purposes. She'd come home buzzing, talking fast, pacing the kitchen while she reheated leftovers and scrolled through her phone. I'd sit at the table and listen, not because I understood all of it anymore, but because she was my wife. "I need you to handle your mom's stuff," she said one night, not unkindly, just efficiently. "This quarter is critical for me." I nodded. I told myself it was temporary. It wasn't. Doctors' offices became my second home. Beige walls, the smell of disinfectant that never quite covered the smell of sickness. Old magazines on low tables, pages curled and soft from too many hands. Mama would grip my arm in the waiting room sometimes, her fingers cold and strong. "Don't leave me," she'd whisper, even when I was sitting right there. I didn't. That's not laziness, that's endurance. But endurance doesn't show up on a resume, and it sure as hell doesn't impress coworkers at a holiday party. As my world shrank, Sarah's expanded. She traveled more. She started buying clothes that looked uncomfortable to wear and impossible to clean. She stopped asking me to come to things. "It's just easier," she said. "You don't really fit the vibe." That word again, vibe. As if a marriage was a playlist you could skip through. I gained weight, yes. My doctor called it situational. Stress, reduced activity, hormones shifting with age. He told me to walk more, stretch, watch the carbs. Sarah called it letting myself go. She liked to point at the recliner in the living room and say, "You in that chair. I swear one day we won't be able to tell you apart." She laughed when she said it. So did I at first. Later I stopped laughing. I just filed it away. Because that's another thing you learn when you get older. Reacting feels good in the moment, but remembering lasts longer. I still did things, just not the things Sarah counted. I fixed Mrs. Donnelly's leaky sink 2 houses down when her son was out of state. I helped Frank from the VFW sort through tax forms after his wife passed, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee that tasted like it had been on the burner since Reagan was in office. I read the fine print on bills, I kept folders, I checked numbers. Old habits don't die, they just go underground. On Tuesdays, after dropping Mama off at her adult day program, I'd stop at Casey's for coffee. Same cashier most mornings. She knew my name. "Your mom doing okay?" she'd ask, sliding the cup across the counter. "She's having a good day," I'd say, even when she wasn't. Those mornings grounded me. The clink of mugs, the hiss of the coffee machine, the quiet nods from men my age who didn't need to ask what you were carrying. Sarah didn't see any of that. What she saw was me at home when she left for work. Me at home when she came back. Me wearing the same flannel shirt 2 days in a row because it was clean enough and comfortable. She started calling me retired like it was a slur. "You're basically checked out," she said once, tapping her phone screen. "You don't even know what's happening anymore." I knew more than she thought. Because when you stop chasing the next thing, you start noticing patterns. Like the way Sarah's stories about work stopped adding up. Like the way she talked about vendors, the way gamblers talk about lucky tables. Like the way she'd toss company newsletters and printouts onto the kitchen counter without looking at them, assuming I wouldn't either. She was wrong about that. One afternoon while she was at work and Mama was resting, I gathered those papers up and took them down to the basement. The furnace kicked on with a groan. Dust hung in the air, warm and stale. I sat at the old workbench, the one I'd used for years, and spread the papers out. Nothing dramatic, just inconsistencies. Numbers that rounded too neatly. Language that shifted from one quarter to the next. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself I was bored. But boredom doesn't make your pulse pick up. Around then, Sarah started using new words for me. Lazy, washed up, dead weight. She said them jokingly, always jokingly. Until the night she didn't. It was a Friday. Meatloaf night. Mom had gone to bed early, confused and tired. Sarah came home late, heels clicking sharp against the floor. She looked at me on the couch, papers stacked neatly on the coffee table, and said, "What are you even doing all day?" I looked up at her, paying attention. She laughed. "To what reruns?" That laugh sounded too much like the one at the party. Light, dismissive, certain. I didn't answer. I gathered the papers, squared the edges, and put them back in the folder. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay quiet and keep your eyes open. And sometimes the man everyone thinks is lazy is the only one still doing the work. The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray Iowa morning where the sky sits low and heavy, like it's thinking about snow, but hasn't committed yet. I was in the kitchen rinsing out my coffee mug when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number, Des Moines area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, almost. "Ray Carter," I said. There was a brief pause, the kind that tells you the person on the other end is measuring their words. "Mr. Carter," a man said, voice calm, and practice. "My name is Thomas Heller. I'm calling on behalf of the board of directors at Hawthorne Logistics." I turned off the faucet. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. "Yes," I said. "We'd like to speak with you," he continued, "privately. In person if possible. I leaned back against the counter and crossed my arms. About what? Another pause, longer this time. About some concerns, he said carefully. Concerns that touch on areas you're familiar with. That word again, familiar. I looked out the window at the bare branches in our backyard, the ones I'd trimmed myself years ago. I don't work there anymore, I said. We know, Heller replied. That's part of why we're calling. We agreed to meet the next day at a law office 2 blocks from the Polk County Courthouse. Nothing fancy. Brick building, brass plaque by the door. The kind of place that smells faintly of old paper and lemon polish. I didn't tell Sarah. That omission sat in my chest like a stone all afternoon. But there are moments in a marriage, especially a tired one, when you know the truth won't be met with curiosity. It'll be met with suspicion or ridicule or worse. So I kept it to myself. The next morning, I dropped Mama off at her program and drove downtown. The courthouse loomed over the street stone and solid like it had seen every kind of mistake a person could make and was still standing. The law office was quiet, too quiet. A young woman at the desk smiled politely and led me back to a small conference room. 2 men stood when I walked in. One was Thomas Heller, mid-60s, wire-rimmed glasses, hair combed straight back. The other was older, maybe early 70s, with a face that looked carved rather than aged. He introduced himself as Leonard Pike. We appreciate you coming, Ray Pike said, extending a hand. His grip was firm but not showy. I served on Hawthorne's board for 12 years, recently retired, still involved. I sat down across from them. The table was scarred from years of use, and I found myself tracing one of the scratches with my fingertip while they talked. They didn't waste time. There had been irregularities, not the kind you could point to with a single email or receipt, but patterns. Complaints quietly settled. HR cases closed without explanation. Vendor relationships that kept resurfacing under different names. The executive team assures us it's nothing, Heller said, but assurances aren't evidence. And we don't trust what we can't see, Pike added. They slid a thin folder across the table toward me. No logos, no drama. Inside were copies of reports, sanitized, summarized, but familiar enough that my stomach tightened as I flipped through them. I recognized the language, the cadence, the way problems were softened until they almost disappeared. Why me, I asked. Heller folded his hands. Because you understand compliance the way it used to be understood. Not as a weapon, not as theater, as protection. Pike nodded. And because you're not part of anyone's circle anymore. That landed harder than they probably intended. I sat back and considered it. Thought about Sarah's laugh. Thought about the folder in my basement. Thought about Mama's trembling hand in the waiting room. What are you asking, I said. Pike leaned forward. We'd like you to act as a confidential advisor to the board. Quietly review materials, identify risks, tell us where to look. And if I find something I asked, then we act, Heller said. By the book. I stared at the tabletop. The old me would have jumped at the chance. The younger me would have felt flattered. The man I was now felt tired. Why the secrecy, I asked. Because the moment this becomes known, Pike said, evidence disappears. Stories change. People lawyer up. I nodded slowly. That part made sense. Then came the part that didn't. Does this involve my wife, I asked. Neither man answered right away. Pike finally said, we don't know who it involves yet. That's why we need you. That was the moment the stone in my chest got heavier. I asked for time. They gave me 24 hours. I drove home in silence, passing the courthouse again, thinking about all the times I'd believed doing the right thing was simple. That night, Sarah talked about work over dinner like nothing was wrong. She complained about people who couldn't keep up, about dead weight dragging down her team. I watched her mouth move. I watched the confidence in her posture. I watched the way she didn't see me anymore. After she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote 2 words at the top. Cost, risk. I listed them out. Cost my marriage, my peace, my health. Risk doing nothing. Letting people get hurt. Letting lies stand because they were convenient. By the time I set the pen down, my hand was shaking. The next morning, I called Thomas Heller. I'll do it, I said. But I want it clear I don't target people. I follow paper. That's exactly what we want, he replied. I signed the agreement that afternoon. Non-disclosure, confidentiality, Scope defined, no theatrics. Just work. That's how I became what Greg Hollis would later call the boardsman. Not with a badge, not with a title people could put on LinkedIn. With a stack of documents, a quiet mandate, and a line I promised myself I wouldn't cross. I didn't know then how close that work would cut, or how much it would cost me before it was over. I started where I always had, with paper. Not the flashy stuff people imagine, no secret recordings, no dramatic confrontations, just reports, emails, policy manuals, spreadsheets that pretended to be clean if you didn't look too closely. The board gave me access in layers. First, the surface-level summaries. Then, as my questions got sharper, the raw files. I worked from the small desk in our spare bedroom, the one Sarah used to call the junk room. The house would be quiet except for the hum of the furnace and the soft tap-tap of my keyboard. Some days my back burned so badly I had to stand to work. Other days my eyes blurred from staring at rows of numbers. I took breaks the way men my age do, stretching, slowly rubbing my knee, telling myself to finish just one more page. I wasn't hunting my wife. I told myself that over and over. I was following patterns. And the patterns led straight through her department. It started with vendor payments. Small ones spread out just under thresholds that triggered automatic reviews. The same services billed under slightly different names. Addresses that traced back to the same post office box. Nothing you'd notice if you were skimming, everything you'd notice if you were looking. Then there were the HR files. I've always believed HR tells you more about a company's soul than its balance sheet. Who gets protected? Who gets pushed out? Who gets blamed when something goes wrong? I opened one case and felt my stomach drop. Mark Ellison, age 61, 28 years with the company, warehouse operations supervisor out of Cedar Rapids. No prior disciplinary issues, no complaints. Then suddenly a compliance violation. Failure to follow updated vendor procedures. The file said he'd been warned. The file said he'd been trained. The file said he'd been uncooperative. The file lied. I checked the timestamps. The training acknowledgement was dated 2 days after the violation. The warning email came from an address that didn't exist anymore. Someone had retrofitted the story. Mark Ellison had been fired. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. I could picture him without ever meeting him, same age bracket as me, probably planning his retirement down to the month. Probably thought he was safe. I dug deeper. Another case, younger this time. Emily Vargas, early 30s, data analyst, raised concerns about vendor irregularities, asked questions in writing. Within 3 weeks, she was written up for attitude issues. 2 weeks after that, she was gone. Her final note in the file was a single-line employee, not a good culture fit. Culture fit? I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The spare bedroom smelled faintly of old books and cedar. I thought about Mama's hands shaking when she signed her name. About Frank at the VFW asking me if he'd filled out a form right. These weren't numbers, these were people. That was the moment it stopped being abstract. I requested a meeting with the board's outside counsel. We sat in a small conference room with a speakerphone in the middle of the table, the kind that makes every cough sound like thunder. This isn't sloppy management, I said. It's directed. Someone is shaping outcomes. Who? A voice asked through the speaker. I can't say yet, I replied. But the pressure point is vendor relations and compliance oversight. Which meant Sarah. I didn't tell the board that part. Not yet. I told myself I needed certainty. Proof that didn't rely on assumption or anger. At home, Sarah's behavior shifted. She became sharper, more restless. She checked her phone constantly. Her laugh took on a brittle edge. One night while she was getting ready for bed, she said, "People are being stupid at work." I looked up from the newspaper. That's new. She shot me a look. I'm serious, Ray. There's noise, and I don't like it. I folded the paper carefully. Noise how? She hesitated, just a fraction. Then she waved it off. Never mind. You wouldn't get it. I felt something old and sad settle in my chest. A few nights later, we sat at the kitchen table eating meatloaf. Mama was asleep. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock over the sink. Sarah scrolled through her phone between bites. I took a breath. Sarah, I said. She didn't look up. What? Sometimes, I said, slowly choosing each word. Numbers don't lie, but they can betray the people who twist them. She snorted. Is that supposed to be deep? It's supposed to be a warning. That got her attention. She looked at me, then really looked like she was seeing me for the first time in months. A warning about what she asked. I held her gaze. About thinking you're untouchable. Her laugh came quick and sharp. Oh my God, she said. Listen to you. You're not even in the game anymore, Ray. You don't know how things work. I nodded. Maybe. She stood up and carried her plate to the sink. I can't deal with this, she muttered. You sitting around all day playing armchair quarterback. I didn't follow her. I didn't raise my voice. I sat there staring at the empty chair across from me and felt the last thread of hesitation snap. The next morning, I met Mark Ellison for coffee. He picked a diner near the interstate, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been poured straight from habit. He recognized me immediately when I walked in, even though we'd never met. You're from Hawthorne, he said, standing halfway. Compliance guy, right? I nodded. Used to be. He looked relieved. Tired, but relieved. We talked for an hour. He told me how they'd handed him paperwork he didn't understand, how HR wouldn't answer his questions, how his retirement plans evaporated in a week. I did everything right, he said, hands wrapped around his mug. I thought that mattered. It does, I said, just not to everyone. When I left that diner, I didn't feel angry. I felt steady. That afternoon, I sent the board a memo. Not dramatic, not emotional, just facts, timelines, names, documents attached. I ended it with one sentence. This pattern causes real harm and exposes the company to serious risk. Within an hour, Thomas Heller called me back. We're moving to the next phase, he said. I hung up and sat quietly for a long time. Upstairs, I could hear Sarah on a conference call, her voice bright and confident. Downstairs in the basement, my old boxes waited. And somewhere between the two, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't ending my wife's career. She'd done that herself. I was just the man willing to write it down. The next 2 weeks felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Nothing exploded right away. That's not how it works in the real world. What happens instead is that the air gets tight. People breathe shallower. Voices change. Sarah came home later and later. When she did, she carried her phone like it was an extra limb. It never left her hand, not during dinner, not during commercials, not even when she brushed her teeth. I could hear the tap, tap, tap of her thumbs on the screen from the hallway, fast and sharp, like she was trying to outrun something. At night, she tossed and turned. Once she woke me up by sitting straight up in bed, breathing hard. You okay? I asked. She stared into the dark for a second before realizing where she was. Fine, she snapped. Just a dream. She rolled over and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. I lay there listening to the faint buzz of notifications coming in and going unanswered. Somewhere down the street, a truck engine coughed to life. The old clock in the hallway ticked on, steady and patient. Pressure. At work, the board moved quietly but decisively. Calendar holds started appearing on executive schedules, special review, document preservation, policy alignment session. Harmless titles that made people nervous anyway. Outside counsel requested backups of emails. HR was instructed not to close any cases without review. Sarah noticed. She stopped joking about work, stopped bragging. Her stories turned clipped and defensive. They're overreacting, she said one night, pacing the kitchen. This is what happens when people panic. Who's panicking? I asked mildly. She shot me a look. You know what I mean. I did. One evening, she slammed her laptop shut so hard it rattled the table. Someone is feeding the board garbage, she said. Someone who doesn't understand how things actually get done. I took a sip of my coffee. It had gone cold without me noticing, or someone who does. Her eyes flicked to me, just for a second. That was new. The next day she went through the mail before I could get to it, sorted it quickly, flipping envelopes front to back, like she was looking for something specific. Anything important? I asked. No, she said too fast. Pressure. The board asked me to attend meetings remotely, camera off, microphone muted. I listened as executives talked themselves in circles, careful with every word, suddenly very interested in policy language they'd ignored for years. I heard fear disguised as confidence. One afternoon, Thomas Heller called me directly. We're scheduling a special leadership session, he said. Company-wide, transparency initiative. I almost smiled at that. Transparency, another word that sounded nice and cut deep. When I asked, 2 weeks. I hung up and leaned back in my chair. My back protested sharp and hot. I stood slowly, walked to the window, and watched snow start to fall light at first, then heavier, the kind that sticks. That night, Sarah confronted me. She cornered me in the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher. The overhead light hummed softly. "You've been acting strange," she said. I kept my eyes on the plates. "Have I?" "You're always home," she said. "Always listening." I closed the dishwasher and turned to face her. "I've always been home." She folded her arms. "You know what I mean." I studied her face. The lines at the corners of her mouth were deeper than I remembered. Her confidence looked tired. "What's going on at work?" I asked. She laughed, but it came out wrong. Too loud. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" "I've always cared." She shook her head. "No, you checked out years ago." There it was again. I took a step closer, not threatening, just steady. "Sarah," I said quietly, "sometimes when you push people out of the room, they don't leave. They stand in the hallway and listen." Her jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said. "I'm telling you how walls work." She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face like she might find a crack. When she didn't, she turned away. "You're impossible," she muttered. Pressure. At the VFW that Friday, Frank asked me if I was okay. "You look tired," he said, sliding a beer toward me. "I am," I admitted. "Life stuff?" he asked gently. I nodded. He didn't press. That's another thing men our age understand sometimes. Silence is support. The night before the leadership session, Sarah barely slept. She paced the bedroom, phone in hand, whispering into it like secrets could still save her. Around 3 in the morning, she stopped and looked at me. "You don't know what they're capable of," she said. I met her eyes. "I do." She flinched. The next morning, she left early without saying goodbye. I sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the wind scrape against the siding, and felt the pressure reach its peak. The cooker didn't scream. It waited. The leadership session was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday. Snow had fallen overnight, clean and heavy, the kind that muffles sound and makes everything feel exposed at the same time. I drove downtown early, parked a block from the building, and walked the rest of the way, with my hands in my coat pockets, breath clouding in front of me. Hawthorne's main conference hall sat on the second floor, a wide room with a low stage, rows of chairs, and a wall of windows that looked out over the river. I'd sat in that room dozens of times over the years. Training sessions, safety briefings, quarterly updates where nothing important ever seemed to happen. Today was different. The room filled slowly. Executives clustered together, talking in hushed tones. HR reps sat stiffly, legal pads balanced on their knees. A few managers glanced around like they were trying to spot an exit. Sarah came in last. She wore a tailored gray suit and heels that clicked sharply against the floor. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was practiced. She took a seat near the front and crossed her legs, phone face down in her lap. She didn't look at me. I took a seat 2 rows back off to the side. No spotlight, no introduction. Just another man in a room full of people who suddenly realized how small they were. At 10 on the dot, Greg Hollis stepped up to the podium. "Thank you for being here," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the room, toward the 2 men standing near the wall. Outside counsel, board representatives, silent, watchful. "This session is about alignment," Greg continued, "about making sure our practices match our values." I'd heard versions of that sentence 100 times. Today it landed differently. He spoke for 5 minutes. Nothing controversial, nothing new. Then he nodded toward the side of the stage. "I'd like to introduce someone who's been working with the board," he said, "to help us review certain internal processes." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. Greg looked directly at me. "Ray," he said, "would you come up?" For a heartbeat, everything went quiet. I stood. My knee complained as I stepped into the aisle. I ignored it. I walked forward at an even pace, aware of eyes on my back, aware of Sarah's gaze finally finding me. I didn't look at her. I climbed the steps and took my place at the podium. The wood was smooth under my palms, worn by years of hands, gripping it in far less honest moments. I didn't adjust the microphone. I didn't clear my throat. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," I said. My voice carried without effort. "I'm here to talk about what happens when rules become tools instead of safeguards." A few heads nodded, others went still. For the past 3 months, I've been reviewing vendor practices, compliance records, and HR actions at the request of the board. I paused, letting that sink in. I followed the paper, I said, and the paper tells a story. I clicked the remote in my hand. The screen behind me lit up with a simple timeline. Dates, names, no colors, no drama. I walked them through it slowly. Vendor payments split to avoid review thresholds. Training acknowledgements signed after violations. HR complaints closed without investigation. With each point, I saw faces change. Some went pale, some hardened, some dropped their eyes to the floor. Then I reached the slide I'd been waiting for. A single name appeared on the screen. Sarah Whitman. There was a collective intake of breath. Sarah stood halfway out of her chair before she realized what she was doing. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the seat. "This is a mistake," she said, voice high. "You can't." I held up a hand, not to silence her, to steady the room. "The findings show a pattern," I said evenly. "One that led to the termination of employees under false pretenses and the suppression of legitimate concerns." I turned slightly, finally looking at her. "Mark Ellison," I said. "Emily Vargas." Her mouth opened, closed. "These actions expose the company to significant legal and ethical risk," I continued. "They also cause real harm." I stepped back from the podium. The board's outside counsel took my place, speaking in measured tones about policy breaches and next steps, about for cause, about referrals. Sarah sank back into her chair. When it was over, the room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no applause. Just silence. The kind that presses in on you until you can hear your own heartbeat. Sarah found me in the hallway afterward. Her face was pale makeup cracked at the edges like dry paint. "How?" she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. "Patience," I said, "and paper." She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. I walked past her and out into the cold. The snow was still falling when I stepped outside, slow and steady, the kind that makes the whole city feel quieter than it really is. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the cold air fill my lungs. My hands shook, not from fear, not even from adrenaline, but from the release. Like a rope finally slack after being pulled too tight for too long. Behind me, the building hummed with activity, phones ringing, doors closing, careers recalculating themselves in real time. I didn't look back. Sarah didn't come home that night. She texted once, "We need to talk," and I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. There were 1,000 things I could have said. None of them would have changed what had already happened. Some conversations only happen after everything else is over. The house felt different without her noise in it. Not empty, just lighter. Like a room after you open a window that's been stuck shut for years. A week later, we sat across from each other in a small office near the Polk County Courthouse. Beige walls, box of tissues no one touched. A mediator who spoke softly and took notes like she was afraid to make too much sound. Sarah looked smaller there. Not weak, just stripped of the armor she'd worn for so long. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said at one point, eyes fixed on the table. I believed her. "That didn't change anything." "I know," I replied, "but you did." She nodded once, sharp and quick, like that was all she could manage. We didn't fight, we didn't cry. We divided things the way older couples do when the shouting is already used up. Accounts, furniture, paperwork. Paper again. Mama passed that spring. She went quietly, holding my hand, lucid, just long enough to smile and say my name. At her funeral, the VFW hall smelled like coffee and fried chicken, and men I'd known for decades clapped me on the shoulder without saying much. Frank leaned in and said, "You did right." I nodded. That was enough. Life settled into a new shape after that. Not better, not worse, just honest. On Tuesdays, I still stopped at Casey's for coffee. Same cashier, same nods. The world hadn't ended because a man stood up and told the truth. One afternoon, months later, I ran into Mark Ellison at the grocery store. He looked lighter. Told me he'd landed a consulting gig with a smaller outfit. Not glamorous, steady. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking away." That stayed with me. The thing about being underestimated is this: it gives you room to see clearly. While other people are busy talking, you can listen. While they're posturing, you can prepare. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits. These days I eat dinner at a little diner off the highway once a week. Vinyl booth, cheap steak, coffee refilled without asking. I sit there sometimes watching the snow blow sideways across the parking lot, and I feel freer than I have in years. Not because I won, because I stopped pretending. If this story struck a nerve, if you've ever been laughed at, overlooked, or written off, remember this: quiet people aren't empty. They're often full of things that matter. And if you know someone who needs to hear that, share this with them. Sometimes all it takes is a reminder that being underestimated is not the end of the story. It's the beginning.